Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Aftershow. Thank you for joining us. I suspect I may have an echo. If I do, I will try to deal with it. Let me know in the live chat. If not, I get to talk. Thank you, Scott, for joining us. I really enjoyed the principal show, and we already have a few people here. So it sounds like there is an echo. I'll try to talk not too much and pass it over to Ansgar and Scott.
I don't hear an echo, by the way.
No, I think I know what the. Actually, I could try one thing to maybe. No, that's not. I'll deal with it. Off to you guys.
Okay, so welcome everyone to the after show. This is, of course, where we open the forum up for people to ask questions from, of our guest. Our guest here is the star of the show, and Nick and I, pretty much don't get involved unless we need to or have some interesting questions, because this is your time to interact with the guests. So if you have any questions, go ahead and put them into the live chat. And if you're not here in the room, if you'd like to join us here in the room, go ahead and click the Discord link in the description. And we'll go ahead and get to some questions.
People hear me? I still have
yeah, I can hear you.
All right. I'll let you go because I've got the echo.
So, Dave, who do we have first to ask questions? Who did you bring in first?
I think we briefly touched on at the end of the segment, but if we wanted to actually just get Scott really quickly to mention what it is that his actual background is before just talking about this blackout, as that might inform some of the questions that he gets.
Sure. Okay, yeah, I can just do a quick intro. So I got into the idea of basic income back in 2013. It was before the Oxford report came out, and it was actually through a Reddit discussion about how no one was talking about how quickly technology was advancing and what that would mean. And so I started looking into basic income as a potential solution for what could potentially be quite a worsening of our dystopia, let's say, just continuing to go along the road that we are. And yes, I got deep into basic income. We're looking into the research, the history, the philosophy, determined that was really an important foundation that we need to build underneath our society and even entire civilization to really move forward and make technology work for all of us. And I ended up crowdfunding my own basic income over the year 2015. It took about a year on Patreon to go from $0 to $1,000 per month. And so I've been living with a basic income of $1,000 per month since January of 2016. And so I'm using my basic income to talk about and inform the conversation, advocate for basic income, and have learned actually more about basic income by having it, and how important it is, what it means, and it really helps me to kind of understand why people what they think about it is so kind of backwards in so many ways. So here I am now after this many years of pushing for this idea, and it's really exciting to see it growing even more. I met Andrew Yang through actually pushing for basic income back a couple of years ago, before he was even running or considering about running. And so it's really exciting to go from a conversation with Andrew about if he should, what I thought about him running, to where we are now, where he has a road to the presidency. If anyone has any questions about basic income, or whatever else, maybe automation or technological employment, or there's a lot of common questions out there, and I'm sure that that whatever he has been asked before, and I'd be happy to answer it again.
So there's a couple questions in the side chat already. The first is what is your favorite Yang policy besides UBI?
Oh, democracy dollars. That's an easy one. It's also, I mean, it's so similar to basic income in that you are trusting everybody with like a minimum amount of voice, and so dollars are voice in like the markets, but it's like because of billionaires, because of Citizens United, we've lost our voice essentially in like the democratic process, and where dollars are the ability to get politicians to effectively listen to you. And so if everyone has at least 100 of these democracy dollars to donate to any candidate that they want, then we could absolutely help flood out the voices of the rich, the ones who are only being heard right now because they're the ones donating, and we could be the ones that politicians answer to again because of these dollars that are now in our hands. And that would, I just think, would be a huge difference to our democracy to be able to uplift people and get the mechanisms of government working for us again instead of only those with where the money is concentrated.
Okay. The next question here is, does the history of enacting Social Security inform how to enact UBI?
Yeah, it's really interesting looking at the history of Social Security for multiple reasons. And so for one thing, it's interesting to see that there were kind of two different groups that led to the like history arriving at Social Security, and this was the Townsend clubs and also the Huey Long's Share the Wealth program. And so both of these involved like it's like with the Yang Gang nowadays is you had these clubs popping up all over the country, and just thousands of them talking about these plans. And the Townsend plan was a plan for essentially like a basic income for seniors. And the Share the Wealth plan was like a very large UBI, and that was funded by going after the wealthy. And basically, looking at both of those, and you see like this rising popularity, and you have the Depression. FDR was trying to figure out what to do, and so from that perspective, Social Security was kind of like a step back from that, and it's like, oh, let's not go that far and have like a basic income for seniors. Let's do like a kind of like worker pension kind of thing that's been federalized instead of going all that way. So it's like there was a lot of pushing for like a bigger ideas, and then we got like a smaller idea because of it. But that smaller idea still did like eliminate a great deal of poverty among seniors. It was just a huge step as far as poverty reduction and improving the lives of those who turn 65. So along those lines, it's really interesting. But also, like kind of the implementation of Social Security, there was an expediency as part of the strategy, and so they wanted to just immediately pass it. Like there were people who you'll hear that even now, and you always hear about these kind of ideas where they're like, oh no, let's discuss this, let's let's take our time, let's slow down. And we know that that's a strategy to like prevent something from ever happening. And so when it came to Social Security, it was like, look, we just need to do it, and we need to get this through Congress, we need to sign it, and it needs to happen fast, so that it happens before it gets bogged down and doesn't end up happening. So I think that was something to learn from as well. And another thing was they sold it well as being very simple. There's a lot of similarities if you look at like old kind of marketing, for this idea with Social Security. It was like, just like a pick of a check, and it's like, get your check. And you see that now with I think it's valuable and smart that Yang is talking about $1,000 a month. And people can wonder, where's this number coming from? And it's like, well, if you keep it simple, and it's easier to get people to understand and get behind. You can't really have like a slogan for, oh, well, I think that based on our GDP per capita and our poverty line, that I think that everyone should receive, $1,874.62, and that's what I'm running on. Like, it doesn't make any sense to do that. You got to keep it simple, and I think it was smart for Yang to do that, and that's also what Social Security did as well back in the day.
All right, so I think Fred is here, and I should probably not talk. I think it's going to distract everyone. I think I'd have to restart the system to fix it. So, unfortunately, Ansgar and Dave are in charge. You're in their hands. It's going to turn into a dystopian future.
What?
Did you want to get Reed's?
This is going to be. It's going to turn into a dystopic cyberpunk future with a huge killer nacho running around chasing people.
Did you want to get Reed's question, and then maybe we can go to Fred right after that in the side chat?
Well, let's Fred ask his question first. So
yeah,
I guess so. Fred asked, "Have you ever considered running for office?"
Oh, okay. Yeah, I see that now.
Yeah. So I feel very similarly to Yang on this question. I feel like, because I'm not crazy, I've never had any interest in running for any kind of office. And I think it's, and along the same lines as Yang too, that with Trump's win, it did kind of change the way that I think about this a bit as well, where it's like, on the one hand, Trump has shown that anyone can essentially win, at least, anyone with the means and the money necessary to run can do that. But also, you don't have to be like a politician. You don't have to have followed that kind of path. And I think AOC has shown that too, and have been inspiring as far as like someone who was not along that path. You can become an important, member of Congress, and you were a bartender, before that. That's possible. And I do think that it would be important, it is important to have like representatives who actually are among the people, to represent the people, instead of this kind of political class that I've never wanted to have anything to do with whatsoever. So if we're going in that direction, and we're actually able to get more people in who are normal, everyday Americans with, who have lived among Americans and understand everyone, then, and if Yang wins, and that, I think that even show that even more, that we are as a country kind of becoming, like, moving more towards away from this political class and more towards this, let's get like everyday, actual people in office, then I could see myself running in that environment. Like if Yang wins, I could potentially see going for some kind of office of some kind. But right now, I'm just focused on helping Yang get into office, and also just pushing for basic income. And so we'll see what happens with Yang and this presidency, and even who gets elected into Congress. And depending on what happens, maybe I will consider something in the next election. We'll see. But I would certainly be more open to it than I had been just even years ago.
Did you want to jump in there, Fred?
Well, yeah, I think you'd be good, honestly. If you were to run, would you run in your local area, or would you scout out an area to run?
It's a good question. I mean, I've never really considered that. I'm not even sure that I'm going to be here where I am right now, a year or two from now. Like if Yang wins, I can really see myself moving to the DC area to be like, part of that, doing something. And so I would think that would impact what I do. And if he doesn't win, I can see myself, moving somewhere else as well, instead of continuing to live in New Orleans. So there's kind of like, it's kind of up in the air. I'm not sure what my journey, where that's going to take me. And yeah, we'll see. Like if I end up in, say, Seattle or something, then that'll certainly impact what I run for. Yeah, we'll see.
Fred's saying when Yang wins. Do you want to get Reed's question in the side chat, and I'll take a look back out on the outside chat there, Ansgar?
Sure. Let's see. Reed's question in the side chat. Looking for it.
It's inside this chat.
Oh, it's inside this chat. Sorry, excuse me. Yeah. All right. Unless you guys. Is it the I'm a mechanist? Okay.
Yeah.
Mechanist that builds machinist is a mechanist. I'm used to fantasy crap. I'm a machinist that builds the tooling for robotic lines. So I see the need for UBI. But it's hard to get corporations to pay their fair share of taxes that promote societal well-being. What is the path forward to encourage them to support UBI?
Okay, so I think that we're already seeing some of this in like various CEOs talking about basic income. Like as an example, gosh, I can't remember his name, but he's like the CEO of like a corporation focused on kind of luxury goods. I think one of their main one is watches, maybe. And so from this perspective, the CEO is thinking that, hey, we're automating away so much stuff, but who's going to buy our luxury watches? You gotta have income in order to pay for our watches. So let's actually start talking about this basic income thing. So from that perspective, you've gotta have consumers, and we're already seeing like an erosion of consumer demand. And it's interesting too. You can see that there's kind of like a shifting in the makeup of demand, and you're seeing the market respond to that. So the market's responding to who has the money. Well, the money is concentrating towards the top. So you're seeing more like luxury goods, luxury experiences, and these kinds of things, instead of like the mass market kind of stuff that everyone would buy at like a cheaper, more affordable price point. So if you're looking at like a falling demand in like the bulk of the consumer economy, when our economy is 70% consumer based, then these companies have got to start pushing for basic income, is simply so that they have customers with money. So if corporations and various businesses can recognize that there is a falling demand, and you're even seeing this now with with Amazon and what they're doing, sucking up the money from kind of mom and pop small businesses, and even old style brick and mortar bookstores that Amazon has relegated to the dustbin, basically. Like if these businesses can understand that if everyone in their community has money, and a sufficient amount of money to spend there, and they're not only worried about the pricing, about I have a very limited amount of money, I'm going to go to Amazon because I can get the cheapest thing there, and that's what I'm going to do. Versus if you have more money, to the point where you can actually say, oh well, I think I would like to go to the store down the street, go to Main Street in my city and buy something there. Sure, it'll cost more than going to Amazon, but I feel good about shopping in the community, and because I have enough money, I can make that decision. If the companies can see that they'll get more revenue, that this will be good for business, then I think that you'll start seeing more businesses and corporations pushing for that, despite any increase in taxes that you would see.
It seems like there's quite a division in companies that support ideas like UBI, sort of between old money and new money. Like there's a lot more people who have like sort of made a fortune in tech and things like that are willing to go there than people who made their fortune in like coal or something, or where it's more like a let's cling on to everything kind of mindset.
Yeah, you could say that there's somewhat more of an openness to like creative destruction in the tech sector, where corporations can rise and fall within a matter of years or something. You can be on top as MySpace and then fall to Facebook. They're more open to, I think, to this kind of dynamism in the market. And maybe when it comes to older companies, older kind of goods and services or something, then they look at this differently.
And since Nick can't talk, it seems like the perfect time to plug his fantastic book, The Water Thief, and thanks to Amazon, no longer available where books aren't sold. So we've got here's one that I'm sure you've heard 1,001 times. UBI, don't you fear inflation will eat the effects away?
Yeah, that's absolutely the most common first response to hearing about it. And I mean, I can to get into this for a while, because it really is. It's like people think it's like a simple question, and if they just assume that you're going to have a lot of inflation, but it's like there's a lot of factors, a lot of variables involved in this. But I would to keep it simple. I start off with saying, okay, so first of all, we're not talking about monetary inflation in order to monetary expansion in order to cover the basic income. So we're not expanding the money supply. We're not having more dollars chase the same amount of goods and services by creating the amount of the UBI and then just giving it to everybody. So there's a misunderstanding there. And I think it's based on just misunderstanding how universal basic income works, where they think, okay, so universal basic income means everybody gets $12,000. And it's true, everybody gets $12,000. But what they're not considering is that everyone pays into the basic income at different rates. So you're going to have net payers, net receivers, but you're not expanding the money supply to do it. You're just shifting money from the top to the bottom of the middle, essentially.
You're not creating
and so if people understand, right, if people understand that there's not more dollars chasing the same amount of goods and services, instead it's the same amount of money chasing the same amount of goods and services in different hands, then that can already be enough for people to understand, like, then I do think inflation would be a lot less likely than I thought, because I wasn't thinking about basic income correctly. So that's one thing. Another thing is you've got competition. And competition is a major factor, because that's how we, come up with prices in the first place. Like if the market's going to determine how much you can sell something for, and that's based on what other competitors are doing. So if you, let's say you have a store and milk costs $4, then you could raise the price because you think, oh, well, everyone has more money, so I'm going to be able to jack up the price of milk and people will buy it. Well, all you have to do is be a competitor, and the competitor can go, oh, not only will I not raise the price to $8 like this other guy is, I'm going to actually lower the price. Might as well, I'm going to lower it to $3. And so you've got one person lowering the price, one person raising the price. Where are the customers going to go? They're obviously going to go to the best deal. And so therefore, the person who decided to get greedy just put themselves out of business, and because that's just bad business to do that. And you actually see evidence of this in Alaska every year when the dividend goes out. So everyone in Alaska receives a dividend of around $1,000, $2,000 per year, and they've received that since 1982. And every year you see something called, dividend sales that come out. So when the dividend is distributed, you've got like all these sales, and because all these companies are trying to attract buyers and customers to their business, to buy their stuff, because they know there's a limited amount of money, and they want people to spend it there, not elsewhere. And so stuff actually gets cheaper during that time. And so that's like a good example of competition working. And so, yeah, there are instances where, there isn't competition, or maybe there's collusion, price fixing, these kinds of practices where you could potentially raise the price because there is no competition. But then another factor of basic income is you actually create more competition, because like it's essentially venture capital for the people. So you've got people able to start up businesses more than they are right now, and you actually have more customers. And you see this, it's a very common result of basic income around the world in various pilots and experiments, where like in Namibia, self-employment increased 301%. In the India experiment, experimental condition villages were 3 times as likely to start a business than those in the control groups. You just see this over and over again, where we've got like increased entrepreneurship. And so, increased entrepreneurship means more competition, not less. So that's an important factor. And also when it comes to evidence too, I think it's really interesting to, on the one hand, so you look at Alaska, and prior to 1982, if you look at the CPI rate in Alaska, so that's the Consumer Price Index, it's the common measure for inflation. CPI was actually rising at a faster rate than the national rate prior to 1982. And then after the first dividend, and ever since, the CPI rate has been rising more slowly than the national rate in Alaska. So the hypothesis that says you'd immediately see inflation, that absolutely disproves it, because the opposite happened there. There should be some amount of inflation based on that hypothesis, and there isn't. And you see that the same thing happened in Macau, where they have a dividend as well. And you see their inflation rate has gone down since they started distributing the dividends. So that also is interesting. And then there was actually a new study that just came out actually just a few days ago, and that was from a big study from Give Directly. And that was like one of the only random controlled trials that actually looked at a macro scale cash grant. And so that is interesting in itself, because it's almost thought by a lot of economists that you can't really study macroeconomics at like an RCT kind of thing. But they did. So they distributed an amount of money to recipients that was effectively 15% of GDP. So this is like a large amount of money. And it was just an unconditional cash grant people could use on anything. So a big increase in spending power. What happened? Well, it turns out that there was less than 1% in inflation, practically zero. And at the same time, every dollar that was provided to the recipients resulted in $2.60, like the economic multiplier for GDP. So that was great for economic growth. It made a huge difference in a lot of people earned incomes. And this even spilled over to people who didn't receive the income, and they were better off too, because they got paid more, they were able to get jobs. So that was great for the economy, and no one was worse off because you didn't see any of this inflation. So like experimentally, and if you can look at where something very close to basic income has existed, where you just do not see this inflation thing happening. And you would not expect to if you look at like the variables and understand that you are not creating money, that there is competition. And also it depends on like stuff like the goods too. So if you can actually increase demand, and by increasing demand, you increase supply. And so if you're selling a good or service that has an easily increasable supply, then you're not going to expect to see any kind of price increase because you don't need to. You have to increase prices when demand outstrips supply. And so therefore, if you've got like your kind of luxury goods, kind of handmade stuff that you can't create more of, you could expect to see some price increases there, at least temporarily, because then the whole point again of prices is if prices go up, then you're going to have more people wanting to actually profit from that. So then you increase the supply to capture that money, and then prices go down again. So you could expect to see an increase temporarily in like the goods limited in supply, but you would not expect to see increases in goods that, especially with goods that are infinite, like digital goods, but also with goods that are easily ramped up according to supply. And if you look at the manufacturing capacity of the U.S., we're at about like 70 something % of our capacity. So we could easily create more stuff if there was an increase in demand.
So Eris 106 says, do you think many U.S. citizens will move to poor developing countries and spend their UBI where the $1,000 goes a long way? And I think there's a troll in the chat that says, should voting be a requirement to receive UBI?
Okay, so as far as like the living in other countries thing, that's part of even the debate process as to how UBI would be implemented. Like I think Yang has mentioned this before, and he doesn't envision someone being able to have a basic income, who lives outside the country for over a certain amount of time. And so it would be, to receive the freedom dividend, you would have to, not be doing that. Personally, for me, I think that you should be able to do that. I think that it should be an unconditional right of citizenship. And that if you want to go live in like Thailand or something because your money goes further, then have at it. That's your right. Just like we already allow people to do that. Like let's say if you have a pension of some kind, if you have some kind of savings or even like Social Security, like we don't have any problem with that. It's just that it's like there's an inherent kind of wanting to limit people from using money, a basic income in ways that they want, so it's considered like a soft condition where people say, oh, it's still basic income if we don't allow you to leave the country. But I believe that it should be fully unconditional. I look at it more of like a human right. And because it's a human right, then you should be able to get it anywhere you want to. And it's also why I think that you should even be able to get it in prison as well. And I know that is another like line people will draw and say that, well, why should you get a basic income if you're in prison? You should just get it when you get out of it again. And you should not get it while you're in there. And so it's like these kind of debates are going to be part of the process of when we actually write the legislation for the basic income. And I look forward to those debates and to see, where we can actually agree in order to pass a policy that we can actually call basic income.
Yeah, one thing I've heard people say too is a model of UBI where people who are under 18 or who aren't yet considered an adult, they get half as much of the UBI, and then 50% of that is put into a trust until they turn 18, and the other half. So if you're working with $1,000, then the family would get an extra $250 a month, like as sort of a child support sort of thing.
Better be retroactive.
250.
I got
yeah. 250 would kind of go into the bank each month and be released when they turn 18, so that they actually have sort of a kickstart to get out of their home and put it towards an education or a house or whatever, which is an interesting.
Yeah, and that was even Thomas Paine's view of this too. Yang will simplify this down and say that Thomas Paine supported basic income, but he didn't really support basic income. He supported, like you can say, he supported the idea behind it, where he envisioned a universal cash grant that people received at the age of turning 21, and that was their like natural inheritance that everyone should receive. And so you can absolutely apply that logic to basic income as well. And yeah, so when it comes to kids too, I think that is an important part of the policy. If I were designing it, I think that there should be a portion for kids, and that's because that kids costs money. Like if you're, my goal is to eliminate as much poverty as possible. And so if you have, you know, let's say it's a household of 4. We measure that poverty line as being, you know, so household of 1 is poverty is $12,000 essentially, $16,000 for a family or household of 2, $20,000 for a family of 3, $24,000 for a family of 4. So if you're a household of 4 and you have 2 parents, then with the freedom dividend, then you still have essentially eliminated poverty for that household. So that works. But if you are a single parent and you have 3 kids, then you're only getting $12,000 and your poverty line is $24,000. And so that's a problem, I think. And so if you gave a partial amount to kids, then it would be, say, $4,000 per kid. Then that's able to scale per poverty line per household. And so then you would have effectively eliminated poverty for any household size, for any household makeup. And I think that's the best way to go about basic income. And I think that you know, if we were to pass the freedom dividend, then I think people would be, you know, more open to that. I think that's an important first step, and you know, we can further improve this. So I think that's you know, the optimal way of going about the basic income to make sure kids are covered.
I've heard Andrew say a number of times that the UBI is just the floor. It's not necessarily the only program that would be running. I see somebody in the chat saying, is it expected that $1,000 a month is going to move the needle on moving people out of poverty? There's some people who are saying, I suspect UBI has been planned for because of the legalization of marijuana. You'll see huge crackdowns on other drugs, which isn't necessarily the case with Yang wanting to legalize the other drugs as well, right? He seems to have a lot of concurrent policies.
So I guess the common thing about poverty, when I'll answer that question too, you know, because it's weird. You see a lot of this from the left, where they're like, well, is $1,000 really enough? And you know, so we measure poverty it's an income level. So we're saying that if you're a single adult and you're above, I think it's like $12,800 or something right now. And if you're above that line, you're not in poverty. And if you're below that line, then you're in poverty. So if you lift everyone up to that line, you can effectively eliminate poverty entirely based on how we define it. So will basic income prevent poverty or reduce poverty? You know, absolutely, because that's how we measure it. And we're actually, you know, the manifestations of poverty is the lack of income. So if everyone actually has a starting amount of income, and it's, you know, sufficient to lift them to the poverty lines that they're starting there, then it's so much easier to actually get much further above that line. Like right now, you can almost kind of imagine it as being like quicksand, like the way poverty works. So like if you're in poverty, it's like really hard to get out of it. And then once you're like out of it, then you're more likely to, you know, jump up in the air. It's easier once you're out of like this goop to raise yourself higher. And so if we build, like, essentially, if we pave over this this like quicksand that poverty is, and that to create this hard floor, then yeah, it's so much easier to build off of that. You know, like they say, it takes money to make money. And as Martin Luther King said, that, you know, it's cruel to you know, look at a bootless man and, you know, tell him to lift him up by his bootstraps. You know, you have to actually have boots. And if you make sure that everybody has boots, then sure, now you can start saying that you can lift yourself up by your bootstraps. But poverty really actively prevents people from a lot, and that's the lack of resources. If we make sure that people have access to the resources through cash, then we will eliminate so many of these problems and costs of poverty, especially including like you to have better health, better education. And there's a lot of evidence behind this too that I highly recommend people actually look into. And I would also say too that you don't need to have, say, $1,000 a month in order to like achieve positive outcomes. You can have less. Like I think if you were to provide a dividend to everybody and it was just $200 per month, that is not bad in any way. It's not like somehow it doesn't, like people say, oh, it needs to be a certain amount or else like employers will lower their wages and it'll be absorbed and da da da. It's like, no, if any amount of money is additional economic security and it's less stress and it's more power. I felt this even when I was crowdfunding my basic income, where like I reached my Patreon to the point of having like $300 per month. And around that point, it's not enough to cover rent, but it was enough that I knew that I had like my food covered. And so if you have that feeling that you're going to start every month with enough money to like eat during that month, then that's actually it's a huge feeling of security that you didn't feel before. At least for me, I had no idea how much security I didn't feel until I felt it. Like feeling security, it was just like it's like a breath of fresh air, or like, it's like realizing that someone's no longer choking you and you didn't realize that you were being choked kind of situation. So it just any amount of any creation of a floor is better than no floor. And the higher we raise that floor, then the more positive effects that we'll see. But I do think that we have to create a floor to make sure that people feel that unconditional security and they have that increased access. Because starting at zero is just a bad idea, and it hurts people, it hurts the economy, it prevents so many good things from happening.
So I'm
let me
seeing
interrupt
in the
real quick. I can probably kill just before I'm talking. Kill the echo. So I wanted to just quickly add that psychologists have found that people under extraordinary amounts of stress lose between 15 and 20% of their IQ. Now, poverty is considered one of those stressors that affects it that way. So if you're under poverty, even if you could otherwise contribute significantly to society just by the pressure and stress of poverty itself, you end up incapable of competing at the same level because you're always stressed, you're always in fight or flight, you're always under trauma, and then what happens is you are did nobody hear? Yeah, I know it's a bad echo. I'll shut up. I thought I had it fixed.
yeah.
It's weird because we don't hear any echo, but yeah, it's
I know what the problem is. I'd have to restart to fix it.
Yeah, you've got static too. So
I'll just continue what you were saying, because it's a good important point to make. And so there's experiments behind this too that are really interesting, and they're so interesting too because they're effectively imposed upon people. So it's not like you can have normal people, and one of the experiments that they did this with was in a mall. And they had people, and they approached them, and they would ask them questions. And what they varied was they got them to think about an unexpected expense. And so the people that they asked this question to, if they had less money, and they were asked about an expense that really wasn't that big, then like if you look at those with little money and those with a lot of money, there wasn't really no difference. But if you looked at a large expense that was unexpected, you would see a big hit to the cognitive capacity of those who with lower incomes versus those with high incomes, because they could absorb it, they didn't have to worry about it. It wasn't like a tax on their mind to think about this. And so it's like these people weren't actually poor. They weren't actually confronted with this, but just thinking about it actually reduced their IQ by a functional like 13 to 14 IQ points. And you saw this, they did the same thing too in India with farmers. And so what's interesting about that is that these were the same people. And so you could be you, and before like before the season where you're able to collect all the crops and sell them, let's say towards the end of it, you're cash poor, you're just trying to reach that point. And so if you take a test that measures your capacity cognitively, and you're going to do poorly on that test because you're really just worried about trying to get there. And then if afterwards, after that point, and you're like flush with cash, you can take the same test, and you would measure to be much smarter because of the fact that you're no longer like burdened by these economic concerns. So we know that this happens, and if you can imagine this countrywide, like here we are as a country, and we're growing more and more economically insecure. People are just trying to get by. They're just thinking month to month. And so you can imagine like there's this giant cognitive burden on so many people and to an increasing degree. And so we're effectively like, just imagine how many millions of people have an IQ that's reduced by around 13 points because of this. And then so if we lift that burden, imagine the difference if millions of people suddenly gained 13 IQ points, then just imagine just the difference in our country, what decisions we'd be making differently. And I think that and I like how Yang speaks about this too. It's an important point to make where how are you supposed to think about stuff like climate change with like a boot on your throat? And so if you take that boot off your throat, and people are able to actually feel and breathe, then you can think about these big questions, these long-term kind of issues in a way that you can't right now.
So I still see a decent amount of chatter about inflation going on in the chat, and I think that there's a number of points that can be hit on that. From what I understand, with the way Andrew's, at least the way he's structuring his freedom dividend proposal, it replaces some cash-like programs. So you're not necessarily seeing everybody who's in poverty suddenly have an extra $1,000 a month. It could be 300 there, 200 there, 100, like depending on who opts in. It's also an opt-in program, so it's guaranteed that everybody could have it, but not that everybody does have it, which somewhat disincentivizes people because they can't reliably know that somebody has had that increase. And so that's a mitigating factor. And then you have to look at, okay, well, what areas are constantly inflating and never go down? And that seems to be housing, rent, drug prices. Doesn't matter if everybody's more poor, the drug prices pretty much just go up each year in the States, right? And I think that he's got separate plans to address some of those things that are being artificially inflated, like the ability, if people don't want to bring drug prices down, to just seize the patent and do. I think he's talked about just producing certain things that are a necessity federally and lowering the price that way, like things like insulin, for example. And the secondary thing is you're also reducing, for anybody who's on any sort of an assistance program, they're limited in the work they can do, right? They have reporting requirements and all these extra things. And, they're worried if I get a job for a little bit here, then I'm going to lose my benefits, which actually disincentivizes work. It disincentivizes entrepreneurs. So if you add a no strings attached ground level where people are a little bit free to breathe, then you actually see stimulation to the economy. There's a bunch of factors, but it is that about sound correct? Yeah.
Yeah. And so again, we can talk about the inflation question for hours because there's really just so many sides of it and so many details to discuss. And those are more that people bring up. And it's like you raised a good point. It's a good answer to those like who are part of, say, the job guarantee crowd, who believe that, say, a basic income was inflationary, but a job guarantee isn't. The reasoning behind that is because they think that a basic income will reduce the amount of work done in the economy. And if you reduce the amount of work done, then you reduce the productive capacity. And so therefore, there is not more money chasing the same amount of goods, but there's the same amount of money chasing less goods because you've reduced the capacity of the economy. And so that's wrong, because you don't see people who reduce their working, and also our capacity is not like so directly driven by actual human hours. A lot of this is machinery and technology, and so you're not going to decrease the capacity by doing that. But yeah, as far as like the evidence behind hours worked and the work effect goes, yeah, part of it is understanding that the existing system disincentivizes work because of the conditions. You by taking away income through targeting, so if someone accepts a job, they're not actually better off, then why would you accept the job? Basic income means that you're always better off, economically speaking, by accepting a job. So you remove the disincentive that exists under the existing system. And there's an interesting paper that looked at Alaska, actually, and they wanted to determine the effect of the Alaska dividend on work since the dividend was created. And they found that there was a slight reduction in full-time employment that was effectively nullified by an increase in demand that created more jobs, and then people were able to take those jobs. So there was effectively neutral on full-time employment, but there was a 17% increase in part-time employment. And I think that that's a good example, because the demand was increased through the dividend in Alaska, which created more part-time jobs, and then people were able to accept those jobs. It's easier to accept a part-time job than like a full-time job, and also part-time jobs are the most disincentivized through a conditional system, because it only makes sense to get like a good full-time paying job in order to bother no longer qualifying for benefits. So, and if you look at just example after example, experiment after experiment, you just do not see this working less thing that people are so worried about. You see a shift from, you can see a shift from traditional employment to things we don't value economically speaking, but we should. So that's like, mothers dropping out of the workforce, or reducing their labor in the workforce, especially after having a child. So effectively, they can treat basic income as a paid maternity leave, and also students that reduce their employment in order to pursue their educations, their degrees. And so these are valuable forms of work that you could technically see as lower employment, but I don't think anyone would say that's actually bad for productive capacity, and that we're actually going to be able to have, we're going to have less goods and services because of this, work being done that we don't see as work. So I think that's another important element in this. And I guess just a quick thing too, because I know so many people ask about it as well as part of the inflation equation, is specifically rents. And I think it's important to understand that under the existing system, there's effectively less competition between landlords, because you effectively need to live near cities, live near like where the employment is. And so if you're in that situation, you have to be able to be within the distance of your job. And if your landlord decides to raise the rent, then you can't really say no to that. You don't really have that bargaining power to do that. But if you have a universal basic income that's entirely unconditional and is entirely disconnected from employment, then you don't have to live in that area. Like, you can live in lower cost of living areas that make no sense to live in right now. So I do expect to see a reduction in population density in these like really expensive areas. And I think that you're going to see people moving to areas of the country and where their dividends go further, because that just makes sense. We want to spend as little as possible on rent. So we actually have an increased ability to tell landlords to go screw themselves if they're going to raise the rent, that we can't do right now.
Not only that, it allows.
Got about 15 minutes, and we got to bail.
Okay.
I did have a question too. Is are private organizations, private companies, maybe going to cut benefits like maternity leave, or at least paid maternity leave, because they know it's covered?
Okay, so you could potentially do that, and I do think that there's reasons to have like universal policies, like say childcare, or say mandate like maternity leave, that businesses need to do that. But I also like that you actually have that option, and I think that over time we would want to have a higher and higher UBI. And so let's say an employer decides to no longer do that benefit. On the one hand, that could mean that they're a less attractive employer. For the same reason that kind of inflation doesn't happen because of competition. I think that's important to look at competition between employers. You have these programs for a reason, as you're trying to attract people. And so are they going to want to attract people less because people have a basic income? Maybe some would, but also, again, if those who don't become much more attractive, and so you would be losing high quality employees to others who are willing to attract people to them. And that's also part of the increased bargaining power as well, because it's not just a status quo kind of issue. If you have an unconditional basic income, then you have more bargaining power, which means more ability to decide who is offering you the best deal as an employee.
Like two people could get together and say, use the fact that combined they're getting a guaranteed $24,000 a year beyond doing anything else if they're already employed, and leverage that to be able to secure a loan to buy a house instead of having to rent one, sort of thing.
Yeah, that's absolutely part of it too, and there's evidence for that as well from the experiments in the 70s. And so the result from the American income maintenance experiments testing negative income tax in the 70s was that home ownership rates increased 4 to 6%. So if you're looking, and that was actually very surprising to the researchers, because we were talking about temporary grants, so doesn't make, it was unexpected that you say, okay, so are we going to see more people taking out 30-year mortgages if they receive $1,000 a month for 3 years? You can imagine some people would, but it's like you're taking out a 30-year mortgage. Do you really want to do that with a temporary thing? So I would say, based on those numbers, then at the very least we'll see a 6% increase in homeownership, but more likely we'd see more than that, because we're talking about actual money that does not stop, because it's not an experiment. It goes on until death. So we could potentially see 10% or more increase in homeownership rates. And if you see something like that, yeah, you're going to see pressure reduced on rents, because you're going to have more homeowners.
So I think that Nick said he wanted to wrap soon, that he had to go. So with that in mind, was there any final thoughts that you wanted to share, and where can people find you, and what would you like to shill and plug and do all that kind of great stuff?
Okay, so yeah, you can follow me on Twitter or other social media, but my main social media is Twitter. So at Scott Santens. I have a really expansive frequently asked questions list of links at my website at scottsantens.com. And I'm the editor of Basic Income Today, which is basicincometoday.com, which is a good source for, it's just like one piece of basic income related news every day to help like stay on top of things. And yeah, you can follow me on patreon.com/Scott Santens as well.
Okay, perfect. And I bet you that there's probably more extensive breakdowns of why inflation won't happen there.
Yeah, and I have a link about this too. So if for anyone who's interested about the inflation question, you can Google basic income inflation, and there's a good chance that the article I wrote will appear at the top. And if you read that, it really gets into this in more detail.
Maybe you can give us the link and we can drop it in the description.
Okay.
It was a very common theme of what people were arguing a little bit about. All right. Well, I guess since Ansgar and Nick can't talk because he's an echoey beast right now. So if everybody would like to see more of that more often where Nick isn't allowed to speak, then remember to join our Patreon. We'll just add a new poll. And thanks for joining everybody for the In Time After Show. And we will see you next time in time.